Hello everyone and welcome back into yet another week here on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name as always is Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for coming in. Happy Monday to you all. On this Monday afternoon, we should have another great show ahead for you. Of course, we always open up with our Monday Night Football preview. Should be an interesting one between the Dolphins and the Rams tonight. That I go over my fantasy stars of the week in both the NFL and college football. I start my positional rankings for the week, this being week 11 of the NFL season. We are getting into the thick of it, folks. And then we are going to conclude with my Don't Be Surprised If segment, where I make some bold fantasy takes for the week ahead. But before we get into any of that good stuff, I do want to remind you that if you want to view content such as this, shorts, live streams, anything of that nature, consider liking, following, and subscribing to the show on the network as well. It not only allows you to view my show, but other podcasts around the network. A lot of people doing a lot of great things. However, if you want to interact with our shows more directly, consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube. They're a great way to contribute and interact with the show. We want to hear your guys' opinions. You can do one of two things. Click that $sign in the chat box in the comments section. Leave a tip or donation, or also leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns you may have throughout the show. It just makes it that much better, and I love hearing your guys' opinions and me just rambling on most of the time. But without further ado, let's get into our first segment of the day, which will be addressing tonight's game between the Dolphins and the Rams. Monday Night Football at SoFi Stadium should be one of those games where it could be a toss-up, but you feel certain about who you want to take in this game. However, here's my attempt to try and dissuade you from just going with the flow from a betting perspective. The Rams are 2.5-point favorites, and it seems like a much lower spread than people might expect, especially given the home field advantage the Rams have. But I can see why Vegas is not necessarily persuaded to raise it any higher. The over-under itself is at 50.5. The Rams are minus 130 to win. Miami's at plus 110. So as you can see, even between the discrepancy in records, of course, Miami's coming in 2-7, or actually I believe 3-7, and the Rams are on a little bit of a win streak. They're getting hotter again, 5-4, and firmly in position to take control of the NFC West, and they feel they can do that. And this team certainly looks like it could be the NFC West favorite at this point in the season. Before this, it looked like they weren't. That was when Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua both were out with injuries, and the Rams struggled a little bit. However, during that time, they got a vital win over the 49ers, and they have another divisional win over the Seattle Seahawks. Whether or not that matters will be seen later months, but for now, the Rams look like one of, if not the favorite, to win the NFC West. The Cardinals are sneaky in their own right, but the Rams, out of all the teams in the NFC West, have looked the most complete this season. Now, on the Dolphins side of things, this is a team that I feel like continues shooting itself in the foot. I feel like even with the return of Tua, they can't necessarily win games no matter how many points they put up, because they still have that ability with Tua. And that's why I feel Vegas is quote-unquote scared of raising this spread any higher, even though the Rams, like I said, are home field advantage, although it's not the best home field advantage in the league. Let's be real there. But that's not going to matter. What's going to matter is the Rams on the defensive side of the football. And that's the matchup that I want to look out for. The Dolphins offense going up against this vaunted Rams defense, who over the past couple of weeks have gelled into one of the most complete, fearsome units in the entire league. And remember, this was a very young defense coming into the year. Two of their defensive frontline guys, front seven guys, Jared Verse and Braden Fisk, were just drafted, and they had big shoes to fill, replacing one of the greatest defensive players of his generation in Aaron Donald. But they have done that admirably. They have, in the past couple of games, really shown their stuff. And in the back end as well, the emergence and rise of Cam Kinchens at the safety position is one to watch as well. This is just a Rams defense that's fully rounding into form from back to front, and I'm really excited to see what it can do against this still vaunted and fearsome Dolphins offense. The key for the Dolphins offense is that Tua, make no ands, ifs, or buts about it, feels invincible at some times. No matter what people say about his health concerns, whether or not he should retire, he just wants to play the game of football at a high level for this Dolphins team. And that's a quality that we see a lot of in certain guys, but not to this extent. And that's the dangerous nature of this Dolphins team. How much are you going to risk Tua, no matter what he gives you on the field, in games such as this, when it feels like the season is lost? Because even if they win this game, they've lost the head-to-head tiebreaker against the Bills, and while that AFC's division is certainly a shambles outside of Buffalo, you're not really looking to make a big playoff push. So how Mike McDaniel plays Tua for the rest of the season is going to be very interesting to monitor, because this feels like a game where it should be a classic shootout between two teams from different conferences who want to show out on a Monday night. But to what extent is Mike McDaniel going to do that? Because granted, while the Dolphins still are in the AFC playoff hunt theoretically, mathematically, it could get a little bit impossible should they keep on stockpiling losses. And the reason why I feel like they're losing is not necessarily that the offense is trying to find its rhythm yet again, because of the defense. And this defense is one that's been up and down all year. It's had its problems, its injury woes over the past few years now, but still can be one of the better units in the National Football League. They still have the talent at each and every single position group in that defense. On the front seven, you have guys like Bradley Chubb, Jalen Phillips. Even though he has the worst injury luck, when he is healthy, he is proven to be one of the better off-ball linebackers in the league. And you have, of course, Jalen Ramsey, one of the most venerated corners of his generation, still playing there. Obviously, they don't have Christian Wilkins, and that would have been great to have coming into this season, but they got to work with what they got. And right now, you still have two high-end defensive players on your squad, but they're not living up to par. They're not necessarily showing the leadership skills they might need to get this team through a certain rough patch. And so that's why I feel like LA in this game certainly feels like it has the momentum. However, the reason why I kind of wanted to dissuade you from thinking this is LA's game to lose is because of the intriguing betting odds. I feel like the Dolphins with Tua, yes, are much more competitive than they ever will be with Tyler Huntley or Tim Boyle at the helm. But they actually have talent to win games now. It's not like Tua comes back and this offense is still very messy. No, they can still put up points. That being said, the question is, will Mike McDaniel want to risk certain things and try and win this game if it is close at the end? And that's why this one is so hard to gauge from a betting perspective. Because let's say this is a 3-point tied game from the fourth quarter, and it's the Dolphins who are behind. Do you want to risk it all, have Tua come out guns a-blazing in a 2-minute drill, kind of risk something, what with Tua having to do all the things he has to do to win this game, or kind of accept your fate? I don't think the Dolphins are a football team that want to accept their fate, but 2-7 is what they are right now. It's not something they can escape from. It's not something they can somehow claw their way back from, albeit easily or not. So it's going to be interesting to see how McDaniel manages this game. This is not an indictment of the Dolphins as an organization or as a team or as an offense. It's nothing like that. It's a worry about the long-term future of this franchise. Because, of course, they would have wanted this season to go differently. They would have wanted Tua to have played more games. But this is what their season is right now. And until, they feel like they can get this offense in rhythm and potentially pick up some wins, I can't say that this season is going to look good the rest of the way for the Miami Dolphins. However, this is an interesting game to kind of test how far this offense is willing to go for the rest of the season, should they still feel like they can pick up crucial wins along their way. Because, granted, this is still a talented team, and LA, at home, with all this momentum, with this rejuvenated defense, rejuvenated offense, it certainly feels like they're playing with house money right now. They feel like they're going to grab the NFC West by the end of this game and say that, hey, if you want to win the NFC West, you have to beat us. And this certainly feels like the game that can prove it. But I can't necessarily ignore the talent the Dolphins have. And it's just a question of whether or not that talent is going to perform in the way we think it could compared to what the Dolphins organization might expect out of them. Do they want to preserve this offense and kind of pack it in for this year? Or do they actually want to make a go of it and see what they can get out of this season? If that's the answer, then potentially the Dolphins can cover the spread, if not win outright. If they do feel like this is a lost cause of a season, then look for this to potentially be a Rams blowout. But I still want an exciting game, and actually hoping like hell that the Dolphins do win this game as a Seattle fan for us to have any chance to claw back into this division. But I still think the Rams will win. But let me know what you think in the comments about this one. But coming up next, we are looking at my NFL Fantasy Stars of the Weekend. Which guys shone brightest this weekend? We'll be right back to talk about them right after this short break.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind?
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Before we get into our second segment of the day here on the show, I do want to remind you yet again, if you do feel so inclined, throughout the show, you can do one of two things to contribute and interact with it. You can either press that $ in the chat box in the comments section, leave a tip or donation, or you can leave any burning questions, comments, or concerns in that chat box right there, and I will address them on the show. Great way to get your opinions out there. I love hearing them as well. It just makes the show that much better. Without further ado, let us jump into our second segment of the day here in the show. It is our NFL Fantasy Stars of the Week, Week 10 of the NFL season. Certainly one of the more interesting concerning a fantasy perspective of things. Definitely not the best of performances outside of perhaps that very exhilarating Bengals-Ravens game on Thursday night. However, there were some notable ones that I do want to point out and congratulate these players on. And to start it off, I actually have to make a personal apology. to this certain player. So without further ado, let's hear that side of it. See who it is that I'm apologizing to. Is at a quarterback position. This was a guy who was very low on this week. He was on my sits list Friday, and I really did not think that he would show up, albeit against a very weak pass defense of the Atlanta Falcons. But he proved me wrong the only way he knows how, by throwing the deep ball, and he got an upset win, big win for the Saints in Darren Rizzi's first game. Nobody beats the Riz as the interim head coach for the Saints. It's Derek Carr, who of course I am talking about, 16-25, 269 yards, 2 touchdowns, 20.46, and I have to say, I am sorry to Derek Carr for doubting him in this game. I felt like, this was going to be one of those weird NFC South games where it's going to be a defensive slugfest, neither offense can get it going, but Derek Carr proved that potentially the Saints still have some magic left in him. He still has the deep ball, and despite the fact that he has a rash of injuries to deal with in that receiving core, he made big plays, and the Saints defense did what they had to do against, I'm telling you, a pretty stagnant Falcons offense. And so that's why, somehow, some way, the Saints got this upset victory. So kudos to Darren Rizzi, and kudos to Derek Carr for pulling this one out of the hat. It was a fascinating game to watch, certainly helped by a couple of Young Hui Koo missed field goals, of course. But it was still a performance I had to reward. Even though there were some quarterback performances out there that were super stellar. I'm looking at you, Joe Burrow, and Lamar Jackson that I could have included, but I wanted to include a Sunday guy, and why not include a guy who I doubted all week long. Now, the running back position, Chuba Hubbard. How about him for Carolina? He's making us think Jonathan Brooks who right now. And that's probably the reason why we haven't seen Jonathan Brooks this season, even though he projects to be pretty healthy at this point and could have come back a little bit sooner than right now. So, Chuba Hubbard, though, let's talk about how he's kind of reinvigorated this Carolina offense along with Bryce Young. In Germany, 28 carries, 153 yards, 1 touchdown for a total of 24.9 fantasy points. Overall, a fantastic all-around game for this Carolina Panthers offense. Just really efficient, complimentary football. Didn't necessarily do too much to kind of say during this tough stretch they'll win even more games, but it's still a step forward for this group. And not for nothing, even though it was against a fellow 2-7 team in the New York Giants, it's a confidence booster, right? Because the Carolina Panthers had not won consecutive games in quite some time. And so this one felt like an overall victory that just felt good in a foreign atmosphere, nonetheless, for this unit. And Chuba Hubbard's a big part of that. Through his play, I feel like this offense has gotten more relaxed. The line play has steadily improved with all these run looks that they're getting. And overall, Bryce Young looks the most confident he's been in his entire career. So kudos to the Carolina Panthers, Chuba Hubbard, and why not throw in Bryce Young as well for kind of building this momentum, even though it might not last because they have a tough stretch. But for now, let's revel in the fact the Carolina Panthers have consecutive wins for the first time in forever. Then, at the wide receiver position, this is where it gets a little tricky. Not many good or fantastic wide receiver performances this weekend. We have to go all the way back to Thursday night and Jamar Chase's 55-point outburst in terms of a solid wide receiver performance. But if we're looking for just a decent one that I felt got the job done, it's very impressive in this big victory over the Washington Commanders. George Pickens made a lot of great catches, one of the best contested catch receivers in the National Football League, including that acrobatic catch in the back of the end zone for the first touchdown of the day for Pittsburgh. Huge reason as to why I feel this Pittsburgh Steelers offense is just getting scarier and scarier week by week. it just brings out the best in Russell Wilson, and it just brings out the best in this offense. Because if you have to respect the deep ball, you can run it as well. And Najee Harris has been one of the best running backs ever since Russell Wilson was inserted into the squad. And so this complementary style of offense is one that seems unusual to the Steelers, but unique in that perhaps nobody expected Russell Wilson to be able to unlock this Pittsburgh Steelers team. Because yes, George Pickens and Pat Freiermuth were good building blocks for this team, and no one expected them to be complete stars. But I feel like with this new look offense, they really are becoming not just a fascinating real-life team, one of the AFC contenders, but a really nice-looking fantasy team. Because of what Russell Wilson brings to the squad. He can either throw it deep, and you can get good fantasy production from guys like Pickens and now Mike Williams, or, you can get production from Najee Harris for all the holes that open up in the run game, with the downfield passing game. Just a fascinating offense to observe, and I have to reward George Pickens for his part in it, because even though you're not a prototypical wide receiver one, he is one that stretches the field, and as long as Russell Wilson is comfortable throwing that deep ball, one of his best traits, it's something that has to be monitored in this Pittsburgh offense, especially if you're a fantasy football manager and you have a Steelers player on your roster. Because the Steelers' schedule is only going to get tougher. And this performance by Pickens is very noteworthy because the Commanders' secondary, yes, potentially not one of the better ones they'll face all year, but still perhaps a solid litmus test for this offense. And I see this performance from Pickens gives me hope that against the Steelers in a couple weeks' time, that this Steelers offense will be primed and ready to go. And plus, that's one of the weaknesses of this Ravens team. And if they're going to win the AFC North, they're going to have to exploit that weak Ravens secondary. So look for George Pickens' name to show up on this list a little bit more often as we conclude this NFL regular season. And the last player who I want to acknowledge, one of the bright spots for the Falcons in a pretty inept offensive performance, Bijan Robinson. 20 carries, 116 yards, 2 TDs, 29.4 points. And this game kind of felt like the finally game, where Bijan finally proved to be a better running back in the system than Algier, because Algier, all year long, had looked more effective in the Falcons' run game than Robinson. But this game proved to be Robinson's show-out game. But unfortunately, for the Atlanta Falcons, it's been one of those offenses where you get performances from unexpected players, but then your stars don't deliver. But then when your stars do deliver, your unsung heroes kind of fall flat, and then you're in the cycle of win convincingly, lose inexplicably. And so these past couple of games have really proven how hard the Falcons are to gauge right now, because they have some interesting wins, right? They've already had 2 wins over the Bucs, putting them in prime position to still win the NFC South, should the Bucs make a nice deep playoff run, or NFC South run once Mike Evans comes back. But they have shown they are a flawed team, especially on the offensive end. But the X factor can be Bijan Robinson, because think about this. Kirk Cousins, for as effective as he's been over these past couple of weeks, he is still a quarterback who does not inspire me in terms of creating out of structure. And I've seen him, because a lot of times my dad is a Vikings fan, and all those primetime games he was on where he would just be so frustrating to watch in terms of when he gets pressured, just collapsing under the pressure. How it translates to this Falcons team is sometimes a little bit noteworthy, because you would think that in order to fully get the best out of this talented crop of players that the Falcons have at their disposal, and young ones at that, you would want a guy who can create a structure and not just either game manage or work the short to intermediate areas of the field. Because right now, what good defenses, or defenses that can at least generate pressure, are doing is just setting the house against Kirk Cousins and forcing him to try and create a structure which he can't do. And I still think it's because of the lingering Achilles injury, but this is a team that had very lofty expectations coming into the season. And to tie that much money into him, $180 million, into Kirk Cousins for this team to succeed is a lot on someone who's proven that, yes, he can be efficient enough to lead you to the playoffs. But if you want to make a deep playoff run, as I feel the Falcons do, then you need to figure out how to move him around. Because you can't just sit that back there like a sitting duck and get beat up in the playoffs. And even against teams like the Saints, who should not have won this game because they are a highly inferior team. But in that game, you saw the flaws of what this offense is doing. They rely on trying to keep it close too often, and as a result, they find themselves scrambling to come back in certain situations, like they were Sunday. And so that's why I feel like Bijan Robinson needs to continue to be an X factor for this team, and that's why this is a noteworthy performance, and it's potentially a sign of things to come for this Atlanta Falcons offense. Let me know what you think in the comments. But coming up next, we transition from the NFL to college football, talk about some of the big names, performances from this past weekend in college football action. We'll be right back to talk about it right after this short break.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our third segment of the day here on the show, we transition from the world of the NFL to college football for just a brief moment. We'll be talking about the fantasy stars in the world of college football. Now, Week 11 of the college football season had a lot of chaos involved with it. Georgia losing, Alabama trouncing LSU in what was a CFP elimination game, and one where LSU was expected to show up and show out at home against this Alabama squad. You had a lot of close calls, but a lot of get-right games in a certain regard. And these four players, whether they be involved in upsets or, like I said, get-right games, all four of them potentially had a point to prove, right? Or potentially wanted to show out and continue to prove that they are going to determine the CFP picture. Potentially two of them, maybe not so much right now. But still, all four of them had very defining games in the world of college football this weekend. So without further ado, let's discuss them. Let's talk about the quarterback position for the first person to talk about here. My first fantasy star of the week, if you will. This guy has not showed up on this list in a long time, whether it be because of his injury lingering or because he simply, once he came back, did not perform up to par. He just hasn't been effective enough for me to warrant putting him on this list. But against Florida at home, he deserved it wholeheartedly. Perhaps the best quarterback performance of the weekend, truly showing that this offense is capable of making a national title run if he at the helm is efficient enough. And that is, and get to his graphic real quickly, Mr. Quinn Ewers, the Texas Longhorns. 19 of 27, 333 yards, 5 touchdowns, a career high for him, 33.3 fantasy points. Now, it was against Florida, a very, very banged up team that's already going through a very tough season, has a tough stretch after this, and to top it all off, is questioning whether or not Billy Napier should be there, even though the AD is saying that he's giving him his vote of confidence. So obviously, not necessarily against a team that will test him enough, much like Georgia did. But it's still a solid performance that proves that this offense is one of the most vaunted and fearsome in the college football world. And if Quinn Ewers is himself and can distribute the football in an efficient manner, play turnover-free ball, and play clean, and this offensive line can protect him, and this defense has the best potentially in the entirety of college football, continue to play like they have, this is a national title contender. And you can say that Texas, by the end of the season, may not even have a high-profile win. They still have to go into College Station at the end of the year to play A&M in a big match that could have CFP implications, but they are a team that you know has the abilities at each and every skill position to hurt you. It's just about this man right here, Quinn Ewers, and what he can do the rest of the way to truly supplement this offense enough to warrant me saying that Texas is a national title contender and potentially, much like Vegas potentially thinks, the national title favorite. But I have to shout him out for performance. Hasn't been on this list in quite some time. Makes this appearance because of what we know he can do and what he did against Florida. Now in the running back position, this is a guy who kind of shook up the CFP picture a little bit, but this is one of those guys who you're probably going to have a much better season. And in this game at the very least, he did have a solid game, but it is kind of disappointing that it wasn't necessarily that meaningful for his team. And I'm talking about Devin Neal of the Kansas Jayhawks. Now, the reason why Kansas was kind of floated around as preseason Big 12 favorite was because of that backfield, right? Jalen Daniels at the QB position and Devin Neal at the running back position. Two of the more explosive players in the country and in the Big 12. That was why they were getting a lot of hype. But this season, they kind of regressed to the mean a little bit. They haven't been playing up to par. Jalen Daniels has been more mistake-prone, turnover-prone, and Devin Neal hasn't necessarily been able to supplement him. But in this game against Iowa State, that truly affected Iowa State's standing in the Big 12, Devin Neal finally showed up for 18 carries, 116 yards, and 2 touchdowns. And so, Devin Neal is still someone who you can look at and say, I have to respect him for what he's built throughout his college career. He's just not having a good year. Potentially in a dynasty league, per se. If you're looking for a well-rounded running back who you know has had an illustrious college football career at Kansas, a bright spot in those past couple of years for them, you know that he can be effective enough in years to come, potentially if he has an NFL career, to potentially, if you're getting into a Dynasty League format, be someone special. And like I said, he's not always going to be the best. He's not always going to be someone who can make a change for a team. And this year, he's definitely not been that guy who we expected. But this is still a performance that's noteworthy for him, to kind of get him back on track potentially and get him ready for what could be a very intriguing NFL career that a lot of fantasy football players might want to monitor, because he's a very special player and this year has just not been his year. But he did throw a wrench into Iowa State's plans, and that could be enough for him this season. Now we have to acknowledge someone at the wide receiver position who did not necessarily have the best performance of the weekend, but did have a profound record broken in the annals of Ohio State history. And that is Jeremiah Smith. 6 receptions, 87 yards, 1 touchdown, 17.7 fantasy points. Again, not the best, most noteworthy wide receiver performance of the weekend. But what is noteworthy is that he broke the record for the single-season freshman receiving touchdowns record, once held by the great Chris Carter. And that is noteworthy because this is someone who we already knew in spring camp, even before the season began, was going to be special. But we didn't know how special. And now that he has broken a freshman record this season for Ohio State, once held by one of the greats, this is someone we have to acknowledge as the face of college football right now and for the years to come. Because for as long as he's going to play, which may not be long. He could be someone in the sophomore year who's going to enter the draft. And he's going to be a very high draft pick at that. He still is someone who I feel like is now becoming a brand of college football. And that's not something that is said lightly. I feel like what he's done this season is otherworldly. There's been no Ohio State receiver like him. Even Marvin Harrison Jr., Emeka Egbuka, Jack Smith and Jigba. Nobody's been like him this early. And it's scary that he still has so much eligibility left. And so, even though this wasn't his best performances, it was against Purdue, I have to acknowledge him as a truly special, otherworldly type of player at the wide receiver position for Ohio State. Amongst a truly generational crop of them, he might be the best. And then the last one I want to talk about, valiant in defeat here, someone who potentially has been one of the best wide receivers in the nation that nobody's been talking about, but has truly proven that, he has been a stalwart of this team. Jalen Noel of the Iowa State Cyclones. And even in this loss that all but eliminates them from the CFP picture, unless a miracle happens in terms of seeding in the Big 12, this is it for Iowa State. And it was a miraculous season for them. They played some of the most efficient, clean football for the first 9 or so weeks this season, and have fallen flat against Texas Tech and this time Kansas. But Jalen Noel, Rocco Becht, and Jaden Higgins, what a ride for them. One of the best QB wide receiver trios really, in the country. But Jalen Noel, really special game, truly was not the reason they lost. A valiant effort from him. 8 receptions, 167 yards, 2 touchdowns for him. And I feel like Iowa State's going to be hard done by, or feel hard done by, but they have to have their heads held high. Because in that very crowded Big 12 playoff picture, they were seen as an afterthought. This was supposed to be one of those years where this team simply was not going to be physical enough, perhaps, to compete with the big boys. They were talking about Kansas State. They were talking about Oklahoma State potentially. Colorado, which is still in the Big 12 playoff picture, but not necessarily to the extent that people see them now. We're talking about so many of these teams, and Iowa State wasn't mentioned. And so, to even be at this point, where we're saying they've put up such a great fight to even be in a position to say, hey, we nearly made the Big 12 championship game, and we were only eliminated in the final couple of weeks of the season, that's saying something. And Jalen Noel has been a huge part of that. Not many people may know his name, but he certainly earned the respect of the Cyclones organization, Iowa State University, and potentially the eyes of the Big 12. Because this is someone who puts in the work, potentially was looked over from higher end programs, and has made a name for himself at Iowa State. And in this very kind of chaotic Big 12 season, gave his team a fighting chance to say, we could have been Big 12 champions. And not many people can say that. And I know how tough, as a Texas fan, that Big 12 was in terms of trying to win week in, week out. So kudos to Iowa State, kudos to Jalen Noel. But overall, let me know what you think about this list, because I love each and every single one of these players, what they did this weekend, whether it be like Quinn Ewers getting right, getting his team back on track after a bye, heading into a pretty easy end of year schedule, potential pratfalls in their way, but knowing that they have the capabilities to do it. Or a guy like Devin Neal, who it wasn't his year this year, but still put up a fantastic performance to put a dent into a guy like Jalen Noel on Iowa State's season. And then Jeremiah Smith, of course, a once-in-a-lifetime talent. Let me know what you think about this list in the comments. Coming up next, we start our positional rankings for Week 11 of the NFL season with my QBs. Who will make that list? We will be right back to talk about that right after this short break.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. And for our fourth segment of the day here on the show, we're going to be starting our positional rankings for the week 11 of the NFL season. Can't believe we have made it this far. And on this list, a lot of interesting guys who you may have expected to be in this position where I'm saying, hey, you could potentially start them this coming weekend. And yes, a lot of it is down to matchups because that's always a factor in the world of fantasy football. But I do believe these guys are becoming more and more capable each week of making a name for themselves, not just in the fantasy world, but in real life. Some of these guys in this list, a lot of people may have expected how excellent they will be at this point of the season, and yet here they sit, me talking to you about them in glowing fashion. But without further ado, let's talk about this list, starting off with perhaps the most unexpected name on this list at this point in the season. Let's talk about Bo Nix, of all players, going up against the Falcons. Pretty interesting matchup, pretty favorable matchup for him, as I always point out in terms of looking for matchups in fantasy football. But this is actually a guy who I truly believe, and it sounds kind of funny saying it, can be a QB1. Maybe not this year, and you're maybe saying, okay, in a super flex league I can justify starting him. No, I think this is someone who we've seen improve before our eyes and just put in perhaps one of his best, if not his best performance of the season against the best defense in the National Football League, and was one blocked field goal away from beating them, giving them their first loss of the season. So think about that. Bo Nix, from where he was to start the season, a very erratic guy who looked a little bit uncomfortable, kind of forcing things a little bit in that Sean Payton system, to now is someone who I honestly would trust, not just in real life but in fantasy, to win me football games, and fantasy football games at that. 16.1 fantasy points against KC is nothing to sneeze at. It's a very impressive performance against that defense. And who's to say against the Falcons defense that has proven to be inept and susceptible to a lot of explosive plays this season, as we saw with Derek Carr. Bo Nix is someone who I feel can exploit defenses like this. Maybe the Broncos are not a playoff team just yet, and they're definitely in a division that potentially have two, if the Chargers look like the way they're looking. But Bo Nix is someone who I wasn't expecting to say could be a viable fantasy asset this week, and I'm glad that I'm able to talk about him in this way, because it just goes to show that you can continue to improve in this league and continue to get important reps and continue to understand certain systems. And that's what Bo Nix is proving right now. So I think he could be a very viable start this week for you against a Falcons pass defense that he could eat against. And then the next guy, another guy who's pretty unexpected, but is also in a very favorable matchup, still yet to play this week, Matthew Stafford, going up against the Pats. Now, the Pats did just shut down Caleb Williams and the Bears, but let's be real. The Bears had not scored a touchdown in about 20-odd possessions. So I can't say that the Bears' offense is comparable to what the Rams can bring to the table. And from where they were, sans Cup and Nakua, to now, there's really a lot of hope. And tonight's game, it could come crashing down. It could fall off the rails because I still have hope for this Dolphins defense, but I still think that this Rams offense is just rounding into form and primed and ready to go for that playoff push in the NFC and NFC West. So, Matthew Stafford, I feel like, he's not as venerated or respected of a fantasy QB as a lot of people think, but he still is someone who, because of his offense and most importantly his system, can generate enough fantasy production to warrant a start week in, week out. And so, against the Pats defense that potentially is papering over some cracks, still not necessarily a defense that I think week in, week out could be the reason they're in football games. Look for Matthew Stafford to potentially put up big numbers. And not for nothing, for him to potentially be a fantasy wild card for this stretch run here for the Rams. Because they're going to be one of the fun teams to monitor in not just the NFC West, not just the NFC, but in the entirety of the NFL. Just because of what Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua bring to the table. So, again, yes, it's kind of a matchup-oriented decision by me, on my part, but Matthew Stafford is still someone who I'll be looking at highly in terms of this stretch run, in not just real life, but in fantasy. And if you're a fantasy manager and he's still someone on the waiver wire, because he potentially could be, I would pick him up if I were you. Now, another guy who had a very, very abysmal game this weekend, but I still think in this matchup can come back to life, Sam Darnold against the Titans. Now, for some reason, the Vikings have not won as convincingly against these lower tier teams like the Colts and the Jaguars in the AFC South, and coming up against the Titans now. But the reason why I feel Sam Darnold this week is going to have a bounce back game is just because he's starting to trust more options, right? Because the beginning of the season, he didn't have a weapon as versatile as TJ Hawkinson. And as we saw in this game, not necessarily to the best of effects, but we saw a lot more short to intermediate routes in the middle of the field for Sam Darnold to make themselves available to. And so that's why I feel like a lot more can open up for Sam Darnold, despite the fact that this Vikings offense has kind of slowed down a little bit. Against the Titans, look for him to kind of pick up steam. 6.44 fantasy points against Jacksonville. Not necessarily his best performance, but I still think he holds merit in the world of fantasy football. As someone like a Bo Nix, not a lot of people were expecting me to mention his name probably, or for fantasy managers and players alike to be considering him highly. But I still think he's someone who, in certain matchups, and now that he can feel more comfortable throwing the football to TJ Hawkinson, can produce nice fantasy numbers for you. And it's not always going to be pretty for the Vikings. Nothing about this season is for them, because no one expected them to be, at this juncture where they're second in the NFC North. But I feel like, they can gain momentum with this team and how they can play going forward because of what TJ Hawkinson brings to the table. So this kind of goes hand in hand with Sam Darnold and TJ Hawkinson. Do I think that it's something that I would immediately hang my hat on? No, because I still want to see a little bit more of their development as a QB tight end duo. But I still feel like it's an effective reason as to why Sam Darnold could improve and continue to show us what makes him great in these coming weeks. So that's why I feel like he'd be a viable start. And the last one, another simple one, going from GOAT to hero, Derek Carr versus the Browns, finding himself in my positional rankings after being on my sit list last week. And it's against the Browns. I know, this defense, especially the secondary, has been very topsy-turvy. Still one of the better secondaries in the league, right? But Derek Carr, I feel like his deep ball is his MO right now. And no matter how many wide receivers come in and out of that door, healthy or not, Derek Carr will always want to attack you in that manner. He always is looking for that deep shot. And he found a connection with MVS. We'll talk a little bit about him tomorrow and his unexpected rise. But he is just someone who is unflappable when need be. And this Browns team, they can still put up a fight, right? Because that's what Jameis Winston brings. He can still put up a fight. But let's be real here. They're not going to win many more football games this season. And so, even though the Saints are in just as awkward a situation, Derek Carr is still someone who can, with his deep ball, really be intriguing. I'm not saying you should immediately start him right away. Maybe this is a deeper league kind of play here. But he is still someone who, when given the chance, and is willing to take risks in certain games, in certain situations, is still someone who's got it. And got one trait that you could be excited about in terms of fantasy production, that deep ball of his. 26.46 fantasy points versus Atlanta. I know the Browns are a different test, but I still think he has a lot of sway here in terms of fantasy production. Because, like I said, I wasn't myself expecting him this week to show up like that. But if this interim's coaching staff believes that Carr can be effective enough to throw that deep ball, then why not do it and try it? And this could come back to bite me, but going from zero to hero right now is Derek Carr. But overall, when I look at these 4 players, man, how diverse of a list do we have this late in the season? Bo Nix, Darnold, Matthew Stafford, who has never been someone who was respected in fantasy circles as much, and Derek Carr, of all people. Now, this could be a list that, like I said, could raise some eyebrows, just because of, the risk with picking, say, a guy like Bo Nix, who is still, in some ways, a little bit erratic, and picking a guy like Sam Darnold, who's kind of regressed back to his Jets form. Sorry, Jets fans, but I had to mention it. And Matthew Stafford, someone who's never been a reliable option from a fantasy perspective throughout his career. But that just goes to show the depth of the QB position and how much trust I place in matchups and play, and style of play most importantly, from these guys. So that's why this list is so diverse. But let me know what you think in the comments about this list. If you have your own quarterbacks who you think can be viable starts and assets this week in fantasy football. But coming up to conclude the show after this short break, my Don't Be Surprised If segment. My bold fantasy football predictions for this upcoming week. We'll be right back to conclude the show with that segment. Hello everyone and welcome back into the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast for our final segment of the day here, my Don't Be Surprised If segment. Now, all of these predictions are up for debate, of course. But these are predictions that I feel can be justified. Now, whether or not they hit is up to God's hands or up to fate. But I still have fun doing this, concluding my Monday show with that. So let me know what you think about it in the comments, because it's always a lot of fun trying to raise some eyebrows here. Without further ado, let's jump right into our final segment of the day show, starting off continuously singing the praises of a guy who I kind of put down last week, Mr. Derek Carr being a shock top 10 candidate at the position next week against the Browns. And To be honest with you, I believe this one has become less and less shocking. Now, obviously, the Saints right now are a huge question mark of a team. They have a lot of situations to figure out. Their cap positions, what head coach is going to be hired for them this coming season, or if Darren Rizzi will remain the head coach for the rest of the season. So a lot going on in that organization. A lot of external issues, potentially turmoil in this season and in the Saints locker room. But Derek Carr is someone who this season, and no matter how long he continues to play, like I said, has a special talent of making explosive plays. And this weekend proved, yes, it was against the Falcons defense that, again, I'll continue to say is not necessarily the best in the National Football League. Potentially a bottom 10 unit in the secondary. But he proved that if he's willing to take those deep shots, he can potentially bring back the explosive element of the Saints offense, no matter who rotates in and out of this offense with all the injuries they have. And so against a Browns secondary, that's kind of the Falcons secondary, except a little bit better. I feel like Carr can have a very similar game if he continues to be willing to take those deep shots, have the explosive play be an exciting element of the Saints offense again. Because let me be clear, in certain situations as this, when you have an interim guy and you feel like you're going to be rebuilding or rebooting this coming off season, Derek Carr is going to be a player who comes up a lot in these discussions, and potentially in a lot of discussions for teams who could be looking at a bridge option. Now, Derek Carr certainly has limitations, as we've seen this season. He needs to be in certain situations, protection is right, not the most mobile of quarterbacks, but if he shows us in these next couple of weeks that he's capable of continuing to rely on that one of his best traits, that deep ball, then he can be someone who can be viewed very highly this offseason. Potentially as a trade target if they want to unload more cap space to Saints, or potentially as someone who, let's say in the draft, if they don't necessarily rely on a guy like Rattler in the future or Hayner, what have you, they go out and draft and say the second or third rounds and develop him behind Derek Carr for another season. So this is a very interesting situation. But for as long as Derek Carr wants to continue to push the ball in the field, he's a very intriguing player to monitor the rest of the season from a real life and fantasy perspective. So that's why this prediction had to be my top one, because he's someone who can go from zero to hero very quickly. Then my second prediction, my second take of the week, another guy we talked about in the show, but let's talk about a teammate as well in this one, because while I do believe that Sam Darnold will shine, Justin Jefferson might not this week. And I know it's a bold claim because this is Titans defense that has its holes, kind of underrated though, so you can't put it past them to stymie them much like the Colts and Jaguars did. But the reason why I feel like Justin Jefferson might lose a little bit of his fantasy luster in the coming weeks is, like I said, the talent surrounding him, the skill position talent the Vikings have. Now, I think a lot of people are a little bit skeptical about the depth of position groups in Minnesota, but I still like a lot of these players. I like Jordan Addison developing into a very solid player with a lot of speed and rhythm into his game. TJ Hawkinson, like I said, coming back, gives you a middle-of-the-field option who can exploit soft coverages. And I like Jalen Nailor as a kind of gadget guy in this Viking system. So, it's no slight to Justin Jefferson to say he'll have one bad game. It's just that I feel like in this game, we're going to become more and more aware of the options that Sam Darnold has at disposal and how he can utilize them. And so, this is going to be one of those games where we finally see a fully healthy Vikings offense in its rhythm. And this could potentially come back to bite me because the Titans are a very tough team to play no matter how inept they've looked at certain points of the season. But I still think this is an opportunity for Sam Darnold to get back into rhythm, because now he knows what TJ Hawkinson means to him. He now knows what this fully healthy offense looks like and how he can game plan and scheme for upcoming games. So look for him to be prepared in this one, unlike what he was against the Colts and Jags. But it might be to the detriment of Justin Jefferson owners. My third prediction that I want to talk about of the week, another guy who we talked about, all these guys coming back to rear their heads in the final segment of today's show. Bo Nix, QB of week in intra-conference shootout against the Falcons. Now, this is one of the games that I'm penciling as a highly interesting fantasy matchup. I'm going to be talking about this game a little bit later in the week, so I might want to save a little bit of details about why I'm so excited about it for that segment. But it still is going to be a very interesting game because on both sides of the field have the Falcons who come in with this interesting crop of talent. But it's all a question about how Kirk Cousins utilizes it. And the Broncos side of things, Bo Nix's ascension as someone who can be relied upon, it can start to be relied upon at the very least in deeper leagues, potentially dynasty leagues as well. So this prediction, while it certainly feels a little bit wonky, and this game certainly feels a little bit wonky at that in terms of these two teams and how they profile, I think Bo Nix is at the point where he feels that this offense can be operated at a high level. Now, there aren't that many weapons that I'll say are highly vaunted or fearsome in that Broncos offense. Potentially, Courtland Sutton can be that guy in the near future for them. But Bo Nix just really has been the reason why this Broncos offense is more than capable of springing shocks on people. And against the Falcons, like I said, a secondary who I'm not very high on at all for the rest of the way. Look for Bo Nix to take advantage of that and truly be someone who's showing maturity week in, week out. And in this rookie class that hasn't had much success at the QB position outside of Jaden Daniels, look for Bo Nix to potentially be in the reckoning as someone who, as a rookie quarterback, can take leaps and bounds next year. Because that's what everyone's going to be looking at. Because this year, all the quarterbacks from last year's draft have kind of regressed a little bit. But this class, this very special class, had the opportunity to develop and grow even more. And so look for Bo Nix to be the biggest beneficiary of that in this Sean Payton system. Should you know he continue to gain confidence and potentially pick up wins against teams that you might have expected the Broncos to contend with. So that's why I feel this take, even though it's still perhaps the biggest long shot out of all of them I'm giving to you guys, it's becoming more and more of a possibility. So look for Bo Nix to continue to grow and mature. Most importantly for you fantasy football managers, be someone who could potentially be looked at in years to come in different leagues for you. And the last thing I want to talk about, I kind of don't want to talk about it because it is my team and it's not necessarily the most positive of reviews of them, but it still is, as Splash Bro says, Williams not lighting it up. I believe he's referring to Javonte Williams. And I don't necessarily think that's the problem for the Broncos, because I feel like, yes, a lot of what the Broncos are doing is heavily Bo Nix involved. He has to know a lot of different play actions, plays. He has to, take a lot of shots on the field. It's asking a lot of him in that Sean Payton system. But as Splash says, May looks like he got a clue. Yeah, but he's still in a situation where I don't necessarily feel like until, pieces are brought in around him that he can truly succeed and make the Patriots a true contender again. Whereas Bo Nix is kind of making the Broncos a contender himself because of what he's learning through the Sean Payton system. But I do think you bring up a good point in that Williams isn't lighting it up, but I don't necessarily think he's the problem here. And Splash Bros also mentions Caleb Williams, who I would rather not talk about because he has been so topsy-turvy that I can't really gauge whether or not he's truly maturing or not because week in, week out, you can play great one time and then look abysmal the next. I think he did against the Patriots, ironically, this weekend. But getting back into my final take of the day here on the show, the Seattle receivers excel from a fantasy perspective, but fall short in their second matchup against the San Francisco 49ers this year. And, I wish I could say it could be a winning effort because this receiving core, when fully healthy, is one of the most vaunted in the league. DK is coming back from that MCL sprain for this game, I believe. And there's got a lot of excitement surrounding the growth of a guy like JSN. Tyler Lockett's still producing this late in his career. But ultimately, the problem does not just stem with this offense. It stems from an organizational, kind of systemic problem here. I don't necessarily think this is the most organized of Seattle Seahawks teams by a long shot. You'll see. But it does have the potential to stick in enough football games. The Seattle offense can score on anybody. It's just that they seemingly shoot themselves in the foot too many times to say that they can win games like this against the San Francisco 49ers. Because remember last game, a lot of the points they scored in the second half were catch-up points. They had that lucky kickoff return touchdown. And they had a lot of garbage time points. But until this offense, especially along that line, proves that they can be efficient, make plays ahead of schedule, keep ahead of schedule most importantly, and prove that their shootout style of play is effective enough to win football games, then I have hope for them. But that being said, this receiver core is highly, highly fearsome. And from a fantasy perspective, I'm looking at this one to carry the week for you. But unfortunately, from a real-life perspective, as a Seattle Seahawks fan, this shootout style only works if you play mistake-free for an entire game, and they proved they can't. They come up short in this one. Let me know what you think in the comments about this segment. Well, just about do it for the show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. I've been Christopher Shepard. Thank you all for tuning in. Remember, as always, like, follow, and subscribe to the show on the network if you want more content such as this. Consider making yourselves available to the Super Chat, Super Thanks, and Super Stickers features here on YouTube to contribute and interact with the show. But other than that, I'll be back here at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tomorrow for another show. I am out.